At the end of chapter 8, we sort of concluded with some reflections about the efforts of the newly formed United States to create a national identity in chapter 8. And at the same time, men like Thomas Jefferson were very conflicted between what they believed to be the right of government and at the same time the best interests of the nation. And so we saw that Thomas Jefferson, as a framer, had some very different views than he did when he became the president. And ultimately, that is probably, I would feel pretty confident in saying that most every president has shared that trait. Now, we do see that Thomas Jefferson gets, as we called it, the sweetheart of a deal when he is able to purchase the Louisiana Territory. And, of course, he gets a great deal on this land, and he sends Lewis and Clark out to sort of survey the land, to map it, and to have a national record of this new territory. And as we're nearing the end of the last chapter, we see that the country becomes very dependent on each other. So we do become more united in terms of our economy. And ultimately, the northern areas are responsible for turning out the raw products into finished goods. And in the northern areas, we see many different types of textile mills and different job opportunities in those urban areas, to include port cities and other forms of labor. We also see that the western part of the country becomes very important in terms of ensuring that foods and other products are produced for consumption in the east, to include the north and the south. And all of this is really dependent upon the South's ability to continue to turn out massive, massive raw goods. And of course, their ability to do that rests literally on the backs of the slaves that are in bondage in the southern part of the United States. Now, this chapter 9, will talk about defending and redefining the nation. And we'll talk about the reality that as time goes on, the nation becomes more and more invested in the success of slave labor. President Madison's efforts to avoid war with Britain and France included the Non-Intercourse Act, but this act only limited trade with France, Britain, and their colonies. And while the act encouraged growth of manufacturing in the United States, many of the citizens in the United States were very frustrated because they felt that Congress was limiting their right to trade, not just the ability. And Congress was limiting that right. But from the perspective of Congress, they believed it was the way to avoid war with these larger nations and kind of stay out of this conflict. But the American colonists saw this as a central government exerting its will over the wishes of the people. Now, problems in the Northwest Territory gained attention when Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, who were Shawnee half-brothers created a pan-Indian alliance in an attempt to resist the white encroachments and the white culture. Now, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh established a settlement, and this settlement was called Prophettown. And the purpose of the settlement was to further their efforts to build this alliance, but also to resist any sort of encroachment and culture that was non-Indian. They rejected a treaty obtained through very questionable means by the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, that would have granted 3 million acres of Indian land to the United States for $7,600. Now, in a modern sense today, that would be about $160,000, but still minimal money when you look at the amount of territory that the natives would lose, this 3 million acres. But more importantly, for natives, land wasn't something that could be owned, and it wasn't something that could be bought or sold. It was something that, they sort of would use and, care for, but not have possession of. Additionally, money doesn't really have any value to the natives because they don't recognize it as a currency. These are societies that have historically relied on barter and trade, but they don't recognize any value in money from this government. Now, Madison ordered Harrison to attack Prophettown, and the destruction of the settlement ultimately weakened the Pan-Indian Alliance and allowed the United States to direct its attention back to the situations that are taking place in Great Britain. Now, the nation became very divided over the question of whether to go to war with Great Britain. New England merchants and Federalists opposed war because it would negatively impact commerce, while others supported it because they believed that Indian resistance in the West was being encouraged by the British actions. Madison's attempts to avoid war failed, and he compiled a list of grievances against Great Britain for Congress to consider. Now, this probably sounds very familiar. This is similar to the way that the United States, or the colonies at the time, sort of laid out their disagreements with Great Britain. Congress declared war in June of 1812. Now, the United States was really unprepared for war, both in terms of their military and their finances. Budget issues had reduced the nation's military resources, and tax revenues were low because of the previous trading policies. At the same time, the National Bank's charter had expired, leaving the government with no significant source of credit. U.S. ideas about gaining British Canada were met with defeat when the British troops and their Indian allies overcame American troops along the U.S.-Canadian border. Now, Madison won re-election in the fall of 1812 because of the support that he received from the western and the southern states. His defeat in New England and in New York, though, demonstrated the sectional response to the war. Now, this term sectional is very important when we talk about American history. So keep that in mind. We're seeing that New England has become something of its own section of the country. U.S. victories in 1813 did little to encourage the New England Federalists who continued to oppose the war. Some of the participants in a meeting of Federalists in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814 proposed that New England secede from the United States, while others at the convention proposed less radical plans to resecure federal power. Some of those plans included amendments that would limit same state succession to the presidency and restricting the length of embargoes. So the concern was that if we had presidents who were continuously elected from the same state, that they might be more concerned about their own individual state's welfare than the welfare of the nation. The other thing that I want you to make a note of, because this is going to be very important, is that when these Federalists meet, remember the Federalists are the folks who were really in favor of strong central government. When the Federalists meet, a group of them actually proposed that New England would secede from the United States, meaning they would separate from the nation and be their own independent nation. The British invasion of the nation's capital in August of 1814 temporarily lessened the support for the war. But this defeat was followed by an American victory in Maryland and the expulsion of the British from New York and from Washington. Andrew Jackson's troops, with their Cherokee allies, defeated the Creek Indians, who were allies of Great Britain, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March of 1814. This resulted in the United States' acquisition of two-thirds of the Creek's land. Now, the British defeat of Napoleon in June of 1814 led to a desire to end the war, and Great Britain and the United States both sent representatives to discuss a peace settlement. The resulting Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, and this ultimately ended the war and restored both nations to their pre-war land holdings. Now, this means that ultimately nothing changed geographically. The only thing that was accomplished through the duration of the war was that lives were lost. News of the peace treaty did not reach the United States immediately, and in January of 1815, Jackson became a national hero for his successful attack on British troops in New Orleans. While the United States achieved no territorial gains from the peace treaty, the war served to bolster U.S. prestige internationally, and it ended the British Indian alliances along the western frontier. The loss of Great Britain as their advocate left Indian tribes vulnerable to continuing U.S. expansion. Now, here on this map, you can see that through the duration of the war, there's a naval blockade. So it's very difficult for the United States to get supplies from other parts of the world. You can also see along this map, again, this is the original sort of territories, and then this over here is that Louisiana Purchase territory. You can see that there are several major areas where we see significant battles through the duration of the war. But ultimately, when the war has ended, neither side has any more territory. And ultimately, the losers in this War of 1812 are the natives. Following the War of 1812, population growth in the West fueled the demands for internal improvements and encouraged a larger role of the federal government. Steamboats increased trade on the Mississippi River, and the development of the federally funded Cumberland Road bolstered trade between the Ohio River Valley and the northeastern seaports. However, President Madison vetoed bills that would fund additional federal transportation projects. Now, you would think that these Federalists would support these programs that sort of extend the size of the nation and increase the power of the United States. Democratic Republicans began to applaud the expansion of federal powers in the first decade of the 19th century. Henry Clay, a Democratic Republican representative from Kentucky, advocated for the American system, which called for the increased federal funding for internal improvements, federal tariffs to protect manufacturing, and a national bank. Now, Henry Clay's a fascinating fellow, so make a note to keep him in your mind. Congress negotiated with the Osage tribe in the West to secure a right-of-way for merchants. The Santa Fe Trail became a major commercial route between the United States and Mexico. The Erie Canal, which was funded by tolls, linked the Mohawk River to Buffalo, New York. This cut travel time significantly and transportation costs, and also connected Western farmers with the Eastern markets. The subsequent canal systems connected interior portions of the United States to the coastal states and allowed for an increase in trade and created new commercial and manufacturing centers inland. So here you can see, as you're looking at this particular map, in red is all of the major roads that are being built. And again, this is significant because it really indicates the desire and demand to be able to move products, whether raw goods or finished goods, relatively quickly, but also people. We also see the major rivers that are navigable, as well as our canal areas, which help us to move products, goods, and services. So the United States, if we go back just here to 1812, we don't see very many roads. We certainly have rivers, but we don't see a lot of roads and a lot of connection. We're still very disconnected in the early 1800s. But again, by about 1837, we're starting to see more and more roads and canals being built. James Monroe, the winner of the 1816 presidential election, improved U.S. relations with the British, secured the U.S.-Canadian border at the 49th parallel, and established a joint U.S.-British occupation of Oregon through treaties negotiated by John Quincy Adams. To secure the nation's southern border, Monroe sent Andrew Jackson to push the Seminoles back to Florida, but he instructed General Jackson not to instigate conflict with Spain, who was still in the region. Now, Jackson, being Jackson, ignored Monroe's orders and followed the Seminoles deep into Florida, attacked 2 Spanish forts, and executed 2 British citizens. Now, although outraged by Jackson's attacks, both Great Britain and Spain moved to quell any further conflict with the United States. And in the Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded all of its lands east of the Mississippi River and relinquished its claims to the Oregon Territory. Now, this is significant. Jackson does exactly what he is told not to do. And as a result of that, the United States is able to sort of stick it to, if you will, the Spanish and get the Spanish out of Florida. And so the United States is able to increase their territory. In an attempt to limit European expansion in the Western Hemisphere, Monroe quickly recognized new independent governments in Central and South America, and he declared that the Western Hemisphere would be part of the U.S. sphere of influence. Now, this policy became known as the Monroe Doctrine. And ultimately, what this means is any territory that is close enough that it could be a launching point for an outside attack is now in the sphere of influence of the United States. And so the United States has a obligation to be concerned about that territory. U.S. citizens, traders, merchants, and manufacturers established relationships with the newly independent Mexican territories, and some Americans moved into Mexican lands. American merchants also expanded across the Pacific, opening the trade with China and seeking additional markets in Hawaii. American manufacturing increased as a result of expanded trade. Now, while the American system helped to unify the nation through transportation connections, it also reinforced a distinct regional economy, a distinct labor system in each region of the United States, and very specific political priorities of those various regions. The growth of the cotton industry in the South meant that planters continued to expand onto Indian lands, and taking with them slavery and a dependency on northern manufactured goods. The increased importance of the cotton industry did not benefit all Southerners. The Madisons and other Virginia planter families found that soil erosion limited their profits from tobacco and made the changeover to cotton cultivation impossible. Some Virginia planters sold slaves to make money in light of this economic change. The cotton industry benefited other Southern planters and small farmers and provided benefits to Western farmers who sold their food products to Southern and Western towns that served as regional commerce centers. Northerners also increased their connections with Southerners, opening cotton warehouse and establishing trade agreements with the South. They also opened more factories and mills that turned Southern cotton into final products. Northerners traded goods with Western farmers for food, strengthening the ties between those regions as well. So you can see that as time goes on, the nation is becoming more dependent on each other, and politics, economy, and government is becoming very intertwined.